welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this first session entitled Conversations About Loss and Grief, More Than End of Life. And we welcome you to this 5-part series hosted by LifePath and the Community Hospice in partnership with the Albany Guardian Society. And it's an exciting endeavor aimed to help us better understand our emotions as a part of life and love. Felicia is my counterpart from LifePath, and myself, Kristen Vivian from the Community Hospice. We are your moderators today. And just a couple of quick housekeeping items. As Felicia has mentioned upon intro, you will be muted and we ask for your cameras to be off. We invite you to use the chat box for any questions that may come up throughout the presentation, and there will be time at the end for the questions to be answered by the panelists. However, if a question is applicable to the discussion at hand, Felicia or I may pose the question to the panelists as appropriate. The slides for this presentation will not be sent out, but you were provided a link to a lovely grief-appropriate document that everyone should be able to have access to through the Zoom invitation. And as Felicia just mentioned, this presentation will be recorded and posted to the LifePath website for you to listen again or to share with others. And the link to the recording should be available by early next week. I will go ahead and pass the mic over to Felicia, who will introduce our speakers so that they can begin the presentation. And thank you again for joining us today. We hope that you will also join in the rest of the series in the coming weeks. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kristen. So I will first start off with Carla Sofka, who is the professor at social work at Siena College and has conducted trainings on death, loss, and grief over the years, including webinars for the Association for Death Education and Counseling and the Hospice Foundation of America. She has clinical experience with medical, psychiatric, and hospice social work and has served as a member of the bereavement support team for hospice. Carla has co-edited the book, Dying, Death, and Grief in an Online Universe, and the use of the internet as a resource for death education and for coping with loss. In this, she coined the term thanatechnology to describe this phenomenon. Carla has also conducted research on grief following a public tragedy and how museums serve as healing spaces. I will also introduce Darienne. I apologize, I might pronounce your last name wrong, Gagne. The Community Hospice Bereavement Department Chaplain and Spiritual Counselor. She specializes in working with folks who want to incorporate their spiritual, religious, and cultural beliefs and practices in their grief counseling. Darienne is interested in helping grieving people find what grounds and supports them during hard times. Prior to working with bereaved people, Darienne has supported those who were seriously ill and dying. Darienne enjoys working with children, adults, and groups. And with that, I will pass it over to the speakers. Thank you so much.
Okay, and now's the moment of truth to see if my technology is working. So we'll see if I can advance this to our first slide and then off we'll go. Okay, so we have several goals for our time together today. The first thing we're hoping to do is to broaden how we define loss. The next thing we're going to do is to talk a little bit about common reactions to loss and factors that influence those reactions. We're going to spend a little bit of time debunking common myths about grief, and we're also going to talk about some strategies for coping with loss. So the first thing I'm going to do is invite you to use the chat box, because when I've been teaching during the pandemic, one of the things I've learned from my students, and also when I'm a participant, is how easy it is to get bored if you aren't engaged in the conversation. So every once in a while, we're going to ask you to participate by putting examples in the chat box if you would like to do that. So the first thing I want to do is pose a question and ask you to think about what type of events or experiences do you consider to be a loss. So think about events or experiences that you believe would cause someone to grieve. And if you'd like to put an example of those things in the chat box, we welcome that input. And then we'll kind of use your examples as we move along. So you're going to see me fumble a little bit here to get, okay, we've got some people putting responses in there already, which is great. Okay, so somebody's mentioned retirement, which is actually a non-death loss, but a transition, a life transition that I think most people anticipate or try to prepare for. I think sometimes, though, it can happen to people quickly. If, for example, your workplace all of a sudden offers an incentive to retire and you weren't thinking about it, but maybe the incentive is just too good to pass up. Someone else has said loss of mobility. So a change in your ability to move around physically, and sometimes that's similar to a loss of independence, right? Loss of a pet. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as the presentation goes on. So loss of a person, another person mentioning the loss of a pet. There's that loss of independence that can happen for so many reasons. Losing a job, changes in relationship statuses, either through divorce or breakup, children leaving home, so that empty nest syndrome. I'm assuming this might be the death of a spouse. Somebody else is mentioning pets. We have a lot of people mentioning pets. Death of family friends. Doesn't have to necessarily be a relative for a death to be significant. All right, changes in our senses, whether that's eyesight, hearing, or other senses. I know some people are losing their sense of taste and smell because of COVID. And then there's that mystery of whether or not it's going to come back. Losses related to growing older. All right, let's see, we're getting some duplicates, changes in activity, being laid off from a job, divorce, kids growing up and leaving the house, health issues, especially chronic ones. That's very, very important for healthcare professionals to be aware of. Death of a child. Okay, the loss of a loved one due to dementia. So sometimes people don't necessarily pass away, but we lose them in other ways. And that's a very powerful one. Loss of innocence. Yeah, we're going to talk about some of those abstract losses too. Okay, loss of a home, moving, being able to drive, all kinds of great examples in here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk a little bit about a way to conceptualize this, if I can get my screen to advance, because all of a sudden the slides are not moving. So we don't have a backup plan, do we, if my slides aren't working? Okay, hold on. It looks like it may have gone really far. I'm going to just pop out of this and try to talk at the same time, because I know what the next slide was going to say. I'm going to try and get us back to where people can see them. All right. So there are different ways of conceptualizing loss. You have losses related to death. You can have losses of a person, loss of contact with the person for other reasons, whether that's a change. Yeah, I'm sorry, Felicia and Kristen, this is, for some reason, this is not working. So do you have the ability?
I'll bring it up on my end. Give me 1 second.
Okay, so you're going to pull up the slides and I'm just going to talk a little bit. Real quickly, are the participants going to have access to the handouts that we shared? Okay, so there's one handout that I shared that is a loss history checklist that I developed a long time ago to help people think about different types of losses. If you advance it one more, we'll be right where I was trying to get. So there are death-related losses and non-death related losses. So for all of the reasons that some of you mentioned in the chat box, relationships can change, but the person is still living, whether that's being estranged, whether that's moving away, losing contact, or having things happen that change a person's ability to participate in a relationship, whether that's dementia or, for example, in recent times, not having the ability to physically be in the same place because of health concerns or COVID-related rules. There are also a lot of losses that don't involve death at all and may not even involve another person. And sometimes you can think about those as tangible or concrete losses. So the loss of possessions, somebody mentioned moving, and that comes with so many other changes in your social support system, your familiarity with a place. And a lot of those other losses that don't involve death are what we might call abstract losses. So for example, the loss of a hope or a dream or a goal, the loss of the ability to do something that you'd wanted to do for a long time. And I think it's important to also remember that sometimes these losses are permanent. It means they can't be, they can't be reversed. Sometimes losses are temporary, and that might impact how a person reacts to those losses if they're not certain that it's a permanent loss. I think the other thing that's important to think about when you're describing types of losses is whether it's a primary loss or a secondary loss. And what I mean by that is very similar to if you played when you were a kid with dominoes, or maybe you still do because it's kind of fun, and you lined up the dominoes in a pattern, and then when you press the first domino, it hits the second one, and the third one falls, the fourth one falls. So the primary loss is similar to that first domino. It's the original loss. So it might be the death of a person. And the secondary losses are all of the other things that change as a result of that person no longer being part of your life, whether that's, for example, the death of a spouse or a life partner. You might have the loss of income because you're a two-wage earner household. You might have the loss of their companionship. You might have the loss of a role. If you're a parent and you experience the death of a child, it changes your roles and responsibilities in life, and that brings along loss and grief as well. So I think it's important to remember that just because it's not a primary loss doesn't mean that it isn't significant or profound for a person who's trying to cope with that loss. So if you could advance us to the next slide, please. I think we need to go back one.
So Carla and I really wanted to talk to you about disenfranchised grief, which is a concept that's so important because when we have grief that's disenfranchised, it can feel that we will either suspect that other people will not support us or people truly don't support us. So for instance, when we think of any kind of grief that's not openly acknowledged or publicly mourned, if you were a parent and your child died, everyone would know about that. And people would come to you and hold you and care for you. But if you were someone who was looking forward to a pregnancy and you had a miscarriage, sometimes that's not an openly acknowledged loss. It's changing nowadays. You're hearing more people talk about rainbow babies, which are the babies that are conceived after a miscarriage, some people call them. But what is so painful about disenfranchised grief is this sense that you are not connected to others who are going to help you through it, or that you're so ashamed about what you've lost, such as, perfect example, thank you, starting right off there from Lori, incarceration. Perfect example. So people are ashamed when their family members or loved ones go to jail that they don't acknowledge it publicly. Can you, those of you who are watching, please jump in with other disenfranchised grief experiences. Other things that you can imagine that people wouldn't offer support around, or that you would just assume they wouldn't, so you wouldn't say anything.
Well, Darienne, I know a lot of people have said pets, loss of pets, and sometimes people who haven't had a pet don't appreciate or understand the depth of connection that people have with their animals. And sometimes people say, well, you can just get another one. And I think that's a commonly disenfranchised loss.
Absolutely. People say to me a lot, gosh, it hurt more that when my dog died than when my mother died. And I say that a lot in the sense that, you know, if your mother lived very far away and you were estranged, that's a different relationship than your dog who might sleep in your bed. And so, you know, it's not the who that was lost. It's not the who, and it's not the how. It's how you feel it. So I saw some other really great answers here. Addictions. Oh, sorry. I am not a quick reader of comments. So if anyone else has others, but yeah. Oh, I saw health related losses. Yeah. Sometimes we have a health challenge and we just don't feel comfortable sharing that with others. So I think you all,
Children with autism. So if you might have a child with a disability that changes your whole view of their capabilities or their own view of their capabilities.
yeah, and your hopes for the future for them.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all of your great participation. We're going to move on to the next slide because it seems like you all really rape and sexual assault. Another great one. Another really excellent example where a crime has been committed against you, and there's a sense that for some reason you have to be ashamed of it. You know, if someone breaks into your house, there's no shame. But if someone commits a crime against your body, we have a lot more shame. So thank you for the person who brought that up.
Yeah, and we can certainly talk more about any of these topics during the Q&A if people have a desire to do that. So one of the common myths about grief is that everybody grieves the same way, that all losses cause someone to experience similar kinds of reactions. And in reality, it's very important to recognize that everyone's grief is different and unique. And a person can't always predict how you are going to grieve based on what your grief has been like after a previous loss. And I think the next slide is going to talk a little bit about some of the factors that influence how people react to loss. So what I want you to do is to maybe think in your own mind about what's influenced how you react when a loss occurs. And you might discover that some of those things you're thinking about are going to show up on the next slide. So how we react to loss depends on so many different things. We have a variety of traits and characteristics that influence how we react to all kinds of things in life. So for example, are you a very private person or are you a very public person? Because there are private grievers and public grievers. There are people who experience emotions deeply, and then there are people who experience emotions to lesser degrees. A lot of people would say that men and women grieve differently. How we grieve might depend on our age, because if you are young, your emotional capabilities and your cognitive capabilities haven't fully developed, as opposed to older people who have different life experience. Another thing that's important to think about is that how the loss occurred, if it was a death-related loss, the cause of death or the circumstances of the death are going to influence that. And a term that's used to describe this is the death surround. So for example, did the person pass away peacefully at home, surrounded by their loved ones with the support of hospice? Or did the person die in a tragic accident that no one knew was coming? And I think this circumstances of the death also interact a lot with whether or not someone had the ability to prepare or anticipate that loss. So if someone's dealing with an illness, hospice has gotten very good at helping people to know kind of what that path or trajectory of the illness might look like, as opposed to sometimes people die very suddenly because illnesses can come on and take someone very quickly, or if it's an accident, or if it's a homicide or some other kind of sudden death, that's a very different thing to deal with than an anticipated one. The quality of the relationship that you have with a person or someone else in, some other thing in your life is going to influence how you cope. If it wasn't that important to you, the intensity of the grief is going to be different than if it was your whole reason for being. So that's a really important thing to pay attention to when you're trying to help other people cope with loss. And that relates to the next bullet, which talks a little bit about how significant the loss was or your perception of what was lost. The other thing that is important to recognize is that if life is calm and peaceful, it's going to have a different effect on you than if life is filled with stressors and other things that are that are draining your coping resources. If you have previous experience with loss, it may help you to anticipate or at least recognize what is happening to you. If it's your first loss experience, it's a whole new thing to learn how to deal with it and how to even recognize what's part of your grief. Your social support systems are key to either helping you cope with loss, or sometimes social support can be what we call negative support. Well-meaning people can do things that don't help, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that too a little bit later in the presentation. And of course, that relates to the things that you use on a daily basis to help you cope with stress and emotional pain. And sometimes people have coping strategies that are very helpful and facilitate moving forward with your grief. And sometimes we do things that aren't necessarily so helpful. So we can talk about that later as well. Another common myth about grief is that it only impacts who we are as an emotional being. The reality is that grief has an impact on almost every aspect of our life. And we'll explore that a little bit on the next slide.
So when Carla and I are talking about grief being multifaceted, you can see these different components here. There's the psychological, the cognitive, the behavioral, the social, the spiritual, the physical. And we give all of those realms because grief is not something that just happens in your mind, but it's something that happens to your entire body, your entire physical self. So for instance, I'll tell you the thing that I see most commonly in grieving people, the most common thing that I'd say just about every grieving person I've ever met has in common is that they're tired. They're physically tired. And so much energy goes into grieving that it can make you physically exhausted. And people come with pains that, you know, you might be stiff or achy. You have a slide or a handout for you called Symptoms of Normal Grief, which please have a look at. It can be hard to concentrate. It can be hard to remember things. You know, you'll sometimes be with grieving people and they'll walk into a room and think, now, what did I come in here for? Or people can feel restless, angry, helpless, lonely, shocked, worried, crying a lot. Those are things we kind of tend to expect with grief. But one of the things that we just want to really hit home is that grieving is not, it's not just a one size fits all the way it looks for folks who are grieving. And it happens through your whole self, your spirit, your mind, your brain, your physicality, all of those things are experiencing grief. Next slide, please.
Another myth about grief is that it's predictable and that it just steadily decreases over time. The reality is that it's more like a roller coaster ride because it's very hard on a given day to predict what it's going to be like. And certainly the people that have taught me about their grief say there are hills and valleys, ups and downs all the time. So I think on the next slide is, if I'm remembering correctly, one of my favorite images that I've ever seen about grief. And the myth is that it comes in predictable stages. And a lot of people are familiar with the wonderful work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who worked with dying patients and recognized that they had some similar experiences. And over time, her work with dying patients was applied to grief. So she talked about 5 stages of grief, and I'm sure most of you are, if you're familiar with them, you can kind of rattle them off, and you'll see them on the image on the left. That kind of implies that you know, you experience the loss and then you have that kind of shock, and some people will say denial because the circumstances of the death make it hard to even realize or validate that it's real. I think we just passed the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and so many of those families never received physical confirmation of their loved one's death. So in a circumstance like that, it's so easy for denial to be a reality because you just don't have all those other physical confirmation of the loss. And then of course there's that common feeling of anger, but not everybody gets angry depending on the circumstances of the loss. And you can look down that valley at all the other things, and then on the upswing or the parts of what some people call recovery from loss, some people call it adaptation, adjustment. There are all kinds of words to describe when the energy starts to come back, when the hopefulness starts to come back, and when being able to kind of modify your life and adapting to the world without whatever it is you've lost, you kind of come up on that other side. The reality of grief is that it's very messy and unpredictable. That's why when you look at the picture on the right, it's all kind of tangled up and interwoven, because things don't just happen in predictable patterns. A lot of things happen all at the same time. And I think that's one of the things that contributes to that exhaustion that Darienne, you talked about before, because when your heart is aching and your body is adjusting to, changes in eating, changes in sleeping, you can't think the same way you used to, and you just, routine is gone. That's exhausting to try and navigate on a daily basis. So I think the most important thing to take away from this presentation is that grief is really what it is. And I think that's what maybe the next slide talks about, if I'm remembering correctly.
Enter your meeting ID followed by pound.
Okay. I'm sorry. I got a little distracted. It sounds like somebody's microphone wasn't muted. And I think the other thing about grief is people have expectations about how long it lasts. And one of the common myths about grief is that you should be, quote, over it in a year. And I've heard some people say, well, the first year's the worst. Well, and that's not always true for some people, because the reality of grief is that it takes as long as it takes. And for most people, there can be difficult times after a year, some that you can predict and some that really catch you off guard. But typically the grief gets less intense over time. And on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that might cause that grief to come back. So I want you to think in your own experience, maybe what were some of those things that caught you off guard, and how easy or difficult was it for you to figure out what it was that was causing that emotional grief? All right. So on the next slide, there's some information that was written about by a psychologist named Therese Rando, and she talked about these times when grief comes back as a STUG reaction. And that STUG, the STUG, stands for subsequent temporary upsurge of grief, which basically means that the grief happens after the original loss has occurred. It comes back on a temporary basis, so it might be much shorter term than when you were grieving after that loss occurred. And the upsurge of grief is a really poignant way to describe how sometimes it just catches you off guard. And she did a wonderful job of helping us think about what causes that grief to come back, or what triggers it off. And she described 3 different types or categories of triggers or precipitants. The first one that she called a cyclic precipitant is probably the one that most of you would think about or recognize quickly. And some people call these anniversary reactions because they're connected with a date on a calendar. So this would be something like a person's birthday, the date someone passed away. Sometimes there are also like seasonal reactions. So people think about holidays. We're getting close to Thanksgiving and Christmas in a couple of months, and those are going to be really tough times for people for whom this is the first year without a loved one. Sometimes things are seasonal. I know when I first moved to upstate New York from the Midwest, the fall is very different out here, and I was kind of shocked when somebody told me they were going leaf peeping. I didn't know what that was, and then they told me, well, that's going out when the leaves are changing every weekend and enjoying the scenery, the hills and the mountains, right? And one person said, I can't do this year because the person that I used to do that with died, and I can't bring myself to do it. So sometimes people get triggered by not only times of the year, but the third bullet on this slide is what's called a stimulus cued or sensory precipitant. So the sight of those leaves changing brings back the memory that the person you shared that with isn't here to share it with. The other senses that are extremely powerful is the sense of smell, food, baking, and cologne, perfumes, senses that you experience outside, whether that's sounds, whether that's sights, places. The other thing that's incredibly powerful is music. And I don't know, maybe some of you can remember a time when you were in the car and a song came on the radio and it just caught you off guard so badly and affected you so badly that you had to pull over to the side of the road because the memory was so strong and so powerful. And those kinds of triggers are very hard to predict or anticipate, so they can catch you off guard. The bullet in the middle, a linear precipitant, is something that kind of happens on a predictable time frame. These are the life transitions where you're going to miss somebody's presence if they have died: weddings, graduations, celebrations, parties, other special occasions. The other thing, sometimes people experience what's called an age correspondence reaction, which is when you turn the age of someone who passed away. That can sometimes be powerful, because I've heard people tell me that they didn't expect to live past a certain year because that's when their parent died or that's when a grandparent died. And those can also trigger those grief responses for the person who passed away. We put on elements of the criminal justice process because if somebody has experienced a death related to a crime, whether that's a homicide, whether that's a car crash, I think of recently there's been a lot in the news about the families dealing with the aftermath of the limo crash in Schoharie. Their criminal justice process has just had a significant turn of events when the person responsible pled guilty. So I think those kinds of elements can bring things back profoundly when people are going up for parole. So I think if you know anybody who has experienced the death of a loved one due to a crime or a homicide, a murder, those times can be very, very challenging. One of the most powerful quotes anybody ever said to me about grief when they were trying to describe the time element was that a person grieves one day at a time, sometimes a lot, sometimes a little, for the rest of his or her life. And this really, I think, is poignant because it captures the fact that grief isn't over, it doesn't end, and it changes a lot throughout the rest of your life as you're dealing with the aftermath of a loss. Another myth about grief is that in order to be healthy after someone dies, you have to kind of put that person out of your mind. And this is where Darienne talked about kind of the cognitive elements of grief. And this is an aspect of that. The reality is that part of grieving involves figuring out how you're going to stay connected to the person who has died over time.
And today, since we're talking about grief that comes not just from death, let's start with this idea of a continuing bond. So I love what Carla has written here, that death ends a life, but not necessarily the relationship with the person who died. And so in thinking about that, I want to think about that in two ways. One, with the folks who have died, and then also for losses that don't involve death. How can you continue a relationship, say, for the person who gave this great example about rape and sexual assault? How can you continue a relationship with yourself and your own body in a different, now that this crime has been committed against you, how do you continue to have that relationship with yourself rather than cutting yourself off? And so this idea of continuing bonds comes to us from death work, the idea that if your mother has died, how can you still maintain her relationship? Oh, I see, we have some people jumping in already about continuing bonds. So I see support groups. yeah, I'd be curious to know how support groups can help with continuing bonds. I can think of some ways, but I'm curious, does anyone else have ideas? How about being with people with a shared experience? Man, is that like the power of support groups? Being with people who understand, like, oh, I understand what this is like, or I have some sense of what you're going through. And to be able to really be real with each other and be seen with each other. Yes, and for it to be normalized. Exactly. For you to be like, I can't sleep. What's going on? And other people to say, I can't either. Just that sense of, you may both be lost in the woods, but you're lost together. Great. What about continuing bonds with the dead? Sorry, we've got some ringing. So can you imagine ways that people have continuing bonds with those who have passed on? Or maybe some ways that you have maintained a continuing bond, a connection. Objects, naming someone after a lost loved one, tattoos. Those are familiar rituals. Oh, you all are great at this. Endowment in their name. Yes. These are beautiful. Wonderful. Thank you. I'll ask Carla to take the next slide. Oh, please ask people to mute. Yes, I will. Ancestral work, spirituality, excellent. I will ask you to please mute yourself because sometimes that gives ringing.
Okay, so and I think we'll talk a little bit more about continuing bonds and support groups toward the end of the presentation, because I absolutely love the way you've captured the power of being with other people who truly understand what you're experiencing. That's a very special opportunity. What I think these next couple slides do is they talk a little bit about the things that well-intentioned people will say that are really kind of hard sometimes to figure out how to respond. And so we'll talk a little bit about that now. So sometimes people will say you'll be back to your old self soon, or they might say things will be normal again. A lot of people have taught me, and I've learned this from my own experience, that as you'll see on the next slide, that kind of normal will never be normal again. And I think well, I'm misremembering the sequence of the slide, so forgive me for that. I think the important piece is to remember that loss changes us, and that one of the important things to do to cope with loss is you have to remember that it's an active process. Coping with change is active. It's not something that just passively happens to you. And you have to work really hard to figure out how to get used to life as it is now rather than how it used to be. And Therese Rando writes about this concept called the assumptive world. And this is a wonderful concept that I think some people might know as a cognitive schema. If you've ever had a cognitive psychology class, you kind of learn about cognitive schemas or assumptive worlds are the roadmaps that we carry around every day that help us to think about what our day might be like. And there are assumptions that we hold about how the world works and what the rules are on a daily basis that are going to influence how we experience life. And anytime we experience a loss, those assumptions get shattered. They change drastically. And sometimes a huge part of coping with loss is figuring out how you're going to redefine yourself. How do you think about who you are in the world and the roles that you have now that the world has changed? And that takes a lot of very, very active work. Yeah, and Jennifer said in the chat box, shifting that assumption or scheme is a loss itself, because you might not want to give it up, especially if it's a role or a piece of who you are that is a fundamental defining part of your soul. And I think that's when people say there's a hole in me, I have a hole inside. I think sometimes that physical hole can be defined in so many ways. And if you're hoping to help somebody who's coping with loss, you might ask a question to say, well, what do you think is causing that hole to be so big? And give them permission to talk about those changes, because talking about changes with someone else can sometimes help you figure out how to adapt to them. So on the next slide, please. This is the one that I was expecting to be next, because that normal is never going to be normal again. And I think a big part of grief work is figuring out what you want that new normal to look like. And one of my wise teachers, and most of my wisest teachers are grieving people that I've worked with in the past, said, you know what? It was so much easier for me to figure out what to do when I realized that the changes didn't all have to be bad. And the way I take that and think about that is, there an opportunity that's being created by this horrible event that you wouldn't have wanted, but is there something now that you've always wanted to do or be that's possible as a result of this change in your life? And I think that's a very rich question to keep in your mind, you know, if you're thinking about what do I need to actively do to cope with loss. Okay. Other unhelpful things that people say, you should be over this by now. And I'm not sure how many of your personalities are, you know, sweet and kind, and you're always very understanding when people say awful things to you, or if there's a part of you that likes to be snarky. But I think the next slide has a great snarky response if you're in the mood to be snarky, because somebody said to me once, grief is not the flu. You don't just get over it. And I thought, yeah, that is so true, because it takes time and patience. Other people have to be patient with you, but you also have to be very patient with yourself. And sometimes I think people say these things because they've never truly experienced a profound loss, and they just really don't understand how complex coping with grief actually is. So one of the things that I often encourage people to do, and for some people who are kind of shy and reserved, this is hard. For other people, this is really easy, is to communicate to other people what your grief reality looks like, educate them about what you're experiencing, and be assertive and tell them what you need or don't need from them. Because if you don't let them know that what they're doing is not helpful, they might continue to do it. And so as hard as it is to find the energy to speak up, or maybe you're concerned that they won't take it well, I would encourage you to take the risk of trying to help people understand what you need.
Carla, hi. This is a good time, I think, to interject a question that came from Joe, who asked, before we go too far beyond it, can you give some examples of the positive aspects that might come out of the loss experience?
Okay, well, and I can certainly give some. I would love to hear what Darienne has to say, but I'd also love for people to use the chat box, because you may have personal experience that this is a great time to share. So for example, one of the things that someone taught me who had been a caregiver forever, she had been taking care of a spouse with Alzheimer's for 15 years. And one of the things that she did when he passed away, after she got comfortable with the relief that came to her, because I think that's another thing. Sometimes people are afraid to talk about how relieved they are when someone passes away if they've been a caregiver for many years. And she said, I had always wanted to take a painting class. And finally, I had the time. I could leave the house, I could go and I could learn about painting. I could go to the park. She loved to do outdoor scenery, and she finally had the freedom to be able to go to places and nurture this goal that she had had forever. So that was an opportunity to nurture a talent or a joy or a hobby that she'd never had to do. Sometimes people see it as the opportunity to assume a new role. They might have time to go back to school, or they might be able to finally do what they want to do, even eat the meals that they want to eat, because the person who had picky eating habits isn't there anymore, you know. So I think those are just a couple of everyday kind of activities, but also hopes and dreams and goals. So Darienne, I don't know if you want to share anything, and while you're doing that, I'll take a look in the chat box and see if we have any other examples.
That would be great, because I'm a terrible chat box reader and talker
That's
at
right.
the same time. So I actually was thinking a lot along the lines of Carla about if you're caring for someone who's very ill, or especially if they had a long-term chronic illness, their death, as much as you wouldn't choose their death, you would rather have them, can open time and space for you sometimes where maybe you wanted to travel, but your spouse has had ALS, and so it's too difficult to leave the house, or it'd be too hard to take a cruise or to fly. So there are those pieces. There's also sometimes, this can seem a little crass, but sometimes with death comes unexpected money, like life insurance. And if you'd been living close to the edge, you know, sometimes with a death, if you receive some money, that can afford you the opportunity to go back to school, travel, that sort of thing. But I think another important aspect is that often when we talk about death, we're talking about the deaths of people that we love and are very close to. But most of us, in some place in our life, have a complicated relationship with someone we love, that they might not be easy to be with, or they just might have a very difficult personality, but we stay connected to them for a sense of loyalty, familial duty, whatever it is. And sometimes the death of someone who has a particular image of you, you know, you are my daughter, and that is what you are. Sometimes their death can be a positive aspect for you, that you can be a different thing. You can see yourself in a new way. So I think, does that cover that, what you were looking for? I think that was from Joe. Does that make some sense, Joe?
And in the chat box, another example was kind of the ability to spend more time with grandchildren, having the freedom to go out and spend time with your friends. And in the chat box, it also says, whoops, a big long comment just popped to the one I was reading off my screen. Sorry about the whoops. Sometimes we also hope that someone will pass away before they become a burden. And I so appreciate whoever shared that, because these are sometimes the things that people are afraid to say out loud for fear of being judged or criticized. And caregiving is such an intense experience. And I think that's another reason why support groups can be so wonderful, because you know the people who've had those common experiences aren't going to be judgmental in that way. And somebody else, Kristen, has shared, if we think of loss outside of death, we often don't realize the silver lining in a job loss or change. So sometimes when we're removed from a position, an opportunity that you never would have considered might come up. And I think that term silver lining is a good one to think of. I think that's great. So thank you all for those wonderful examples that you're sharing in the chat box. And if we have time, we'll look at a few more of them when we finish the presentation. We're actually doing quite well with time, I think, right now. So I wanted to talk a little bit about theories of coping with loss, because the academic in me, I've done a lot of reading about people who spend time trying to identify patterns and common things that people do to cope with grief. And so a gentleman called William Worden wrote a book called The Tasks of Mourning. And one of the things that he educated a lot of people about is this idea that grief is very active, that we've mentioned before, that it doesn't just happen. And he talked about cognitive tasks. So it's not just dealing with emotions, it's thinking about things. And a lot of the assumptive world concept that we've talked about, are there opportunities that are now present? That's cognitive task, because it requires soul searching and thinking. It isn't just something that happens to your body and your heart. It also involves figuring out what to do with those social connections in your life, because sometimes it gets complicated. If maybe a partner or a spouse or a parent or a friend was kind of the glue that held you in a group of other people, you might have to make a decision about whether you still want to stay connected. Is it still important to you? Do you still have a motive or a desire to stay connected? And sometimes those choices can be heart-wrenching and difficult, because other people may have a hard time staying connected to you. Sometimes it's not always your choice about how things change. And I think that's an example of another secondary loss, that your social support systems might change as a result of grief, but that can be a good thing sometimes. And I think Darienne implied that when she was talking about challenges in relationships. Sometimes it's a blessing in disguise. And I think there are also behavioral tasks, because you have to think about the way you interact with the world in a different way. And another set of researchers from Germany actually called this the dual process model of coping with loss, because while you're dealing with those emotional reactions and other reactions, you simultaneously have to figure out how you're going to change your way of living on a daily basis, or adopting lifestyle changes that work for you and that bring you joy over time, because that's the balance, right? You've got to cope with the loss and the pain while you're finding ways to bring joy slowly and meaningfully back into your life.
Okay, so when we think about continuing bonds, and I'd like to think about, as we've been talking, sometimes things kind of pop up for you, and I'd like to think about, in a non-death loss, let's say a divorce, you can think like, well, how would I continue a bond with someone maybe I don't want to see them ever again? Maybe maybe that relationship isn't meant for us to be friends. Maybe we're meant to move to opposite sides of the world and never talk. But I think an interesting piece of a continuing bond in that situation is that your memories and what you were in that relationship while it lasted are yours forever. So you continue to keep them, and you continue sort of a bond with that relationship, even though it's over, because it was such an important part of your life, because it may have created part of who you were. But in thinking about continuing bonds for commemorating a loss, Carla has given some really excellent examples here, and I wonder if any of you have used others. If there are other rituals that you've done. I know that one ritual that Carla is going to talk about after me is this candlelighting ritual that's done jointly with a group of people all doing it at once, and she'll tell you more about it. But have any of you done anything like this, like kept a spot in your house that was just a memorial for the person that you loved, or had a certain time that was like, okay, every Saturday at 2 o'clock, from 2 o'clock to 2:15, I think about my grandfather? Or have you ever written a letter to them, or imagined what they would write in a letter to you? That's a surprisingly powerful one, by the way. What would someone who you love and lost write in a letter to you? I love this, using technology. Carla is the expert on this, and it is so interesting how, when you are at a loss, so many of us really do need social support. And you can post on Facebook, my grandmother died, and for some reason it feels good to have someone you haven't talked to in 25 years say, I'm so sorry for your loss. Isn't that interesting about us humans? But I wonder, have any of you maybe you set up an altar in your house? That's one I encourage for a lot of people. Altar has a religious sense to it, but it doesn't have to be a religious space. Have any of you done anything like that? If you'd like to tell us in the chat box, we'd love to hear it. Maybe that's for our question and answer time.
Okay, well, and I think sometimes people just need time to think. So we'll come back to that. We'll go back to the chat box and see if it's sliding up. So on the next slide, I think this is where the pandemic, this is one of those silver lining times for me, because teaching during a pandemic has been one of the biggest challenges of my life. But I've also realized that there are some things that you can't do in the face-to-face world that are kind of brilliant online. For example, I have students who would never say a word out loud in the classroom, but the chat box will light up and they'll talk, because it takes away that pressure. And I think what I've witnessed, and some of you may have stories about this too, is that creating rituals that can be done with others is a really important part of coping with loss if you are a social being. And so what's happened now with the pandemic is that some of the rituals that people have done forever we're finding ways to recreate them with technology. So celebration of life, and I put in an outdoor space with physical distancing and masks if there are people who are immunocompromised or concerned about safety, because right now we all have to, every time we think about doing something, it's a different task of planning, right? And things have started to open up, and the CDC is saying, oh, in some circumstances you're fine, but that still makes some people nervous. So I think those rituals that you can do with others, I would encourage you to think about whether technology can help. I've heard wonderful stories about people who have done virtual toasts, virtual memorial services, virtual celebrations of life. I actually attended the graveside service of a colleague of mine who died in North Carolina in November of last year. I never would have been able to be part of his committal service, but since there was a pandemic, the funeral director set up a graveside, and so many of us were able to be there for Howard in a time that we wouldn't have otherwise. So I think getting creative with how you spend time together, just because things are getting better in terms of being able to physically be there, doesn't mean we have to give up some of these things, because I know I have spent more time with family members and friends who live on the other side of the country over the last year and a half than I ever have in my life, and I don't want to give that up. So I think we can get creative with how we do this. So bringing people together in a virtual gathering and defining it in whatever way you think is meaningful, or whatever creative way honors the memory of a loved one or a loss. And I know there are people who have dealt with non-death losses who also come together and have rituals that are similar to death-related losses. I know somebody brought up sexual assault before, and I remember back in my clinical days, I worked with a survivor of childhood sexual abuse who wrote a eulogy for her inner child. And she invited her support system to come, and they kind of had a funeral for the person who she was as a child, the person who she had become as a survivor, and a ritual to kind of facilitate her passage to who she wanted to become. And I think that was such a beautiful ritual that she created, just because I, in my brain, thought, all right, part of her has died. Is that a meaningful analogy? And for her, it was. So I think you can get really creative, especially if you're dealing with non-death losses, because the title of this presentation was "It's Not Just End of Life." And I think both of us are really hoping that you'll leave this presentation with some ideas for how you can take what you've learned about death-related loss and apply it to other circumstances in your life. And I think the other thing, the last bullet on this slide, talks about in kind of doing something in honor or memory of a loved one. I think that was the last bullet of the other slide. So many people have made t-shirts at the Walk for Hospice. I see t-shirts that are in memory of someone. There's a face, and you just know that they're there for very personal reasons. I participate in Relay for Life every spring with the American Cancer Society, not only because I'm a cancer survivor myself, but because I've had family members who've passed away from cancer. And so for me, doing something in their memory, raising awareness, raising funds. I know this past weekend at the crossings in Colony was the Alzheimer's walk, because our students at Siena, the social work students in the junior class, helped to raise awareness of that event. And they were out there on a gorgeous sunny day on Saturday, some of them in honor and memory of loved ones who had dealt with Alzheimer's. And the Out of the Darkness walk is suicide prevention and suicide awareness. So there are all kinds of ways that people can do something meaningful. And I think this is another way that an opportunity can be defined. You can have a tragedy that occurs, and you can bring about positive changes, whether that's educating people to prevent someone else from experiencing the same tragedy, changing laws, advocating for policy changes. I mean, look at what the students in Parkland, Florida did after the shooting at their school. Within 48 hours, they were lobbying politicians to change the gun access laws. And I'm reading lots of books now that these kids have written, and what they say is that they had to turn their anger into action, and that was their way. You know, some people criticized them because they weren't coping with their grief. That was their grief, and that was their coping strategy. So sometimes coping strategies look different than how they might look for us, but that doesn't mean it isn't important or meaningful for the person who's participating in it. So I think if you're trying to support someone who's coping with grief, being able to step back and try to understand from their perspective what that activity is serving for them can be really, really important. And you might discover that there's something you want to do to advocate for change that would also bring meaning to your loss. I think the other thing that we wanted to mention is that it's so easy when you're exhausted and overwhelmed with grief to just pull back and pull away from being involved in life. And one of the, I think, really, really helpful things is to fight that tendency to isolate, even if it means just going to a place where other people are out and about, whether that's outside while the weather still lets us do that, or if you're a winter person. I mean, I come from a family of skiers, and I know some people go to the mountains and they go to be out in the snow, and that's incredibly peaceful and calming. So whether, you know, whatever that means for you, getting out and about where there's activity and movement can sometimes help find a little bit more energy. And during times of COVID and the changing realities, I know that might need to be defined differently, but join Zoom meetings, you know, or schedule hangouts with your friends on Zoom. I've talked with a lot of people who have like virtual happy hours, whether that's with alcohol or not, because alcohol can sometimes be a negative coping strategy. So you have to be careful with things like that, but just being together with people. And if that means learning new technology, like learning Skype or FaceTime or WhatsApp, or you know, we all know you know how to use Zoom because you're on this call. So kudos to those of you for whom this, you know, was a new skill that you learned. And I think that's another opportunity. Take risks and try to learn about these new things that maybe you haven't used before. And I think the other thing, just taking good care of yourself, making sure that even if you're not hungry, you try to eat something, stay hydrated, try to get rest, even if sleep is difficult to come by. Try to just give your brain and your body time to chill out, because that's so important. And the other thing is trying to stay physically active, even if you're exhausted, because actually exercising will recharge your batteries and help you feel actually more energetic. So even though it's counterintuitive, it actually works. I think the other thing that people have taught me, and that I've also learned for myself, is that people are constantly saying, what can I do? How can I help? And sometimes that is the hardest question to answer on the fly, because you just might not be in a place where you know what to say. So whether that's keeping a list on your refrigerator, whether that's keeping a note on your phone, I mean, smartphones can be wonderful for so many things now, so that you're prepared with an answer. And just, if it's tough for you to be on the receiving end of help, to see that as an opportunity to maybe change your receptiveness to letting people help you. And if I think we talked about this before, politely letting other people know if they're doing something that isn't helpful to you, because most people haven't attended a presentation, or like my students, they haven't taken a death and dying class, so they honestly have no clue what is helpful. So if they ask, what can I do to help? Don't feel that it's inappropriate to answer their question. So many of you have talked about the power of social support through support groups. So seek out support, even if it's hard to find the energy to do that, whether that's with family or friends, going to a formal support group. Sometimes people realize they can't do this on their own, and they need professional help. And this is where I am so grateful for hospice, for people like Darienne and the other bereavement support folks, because they have so much experience and so much capacity to care and to provide support. So and it's not a weakness, it's actually a huge strength to reach out for help. And going online, sometimes you can find websites that have a lot of helpful information that talk about normal reactions to loss. For example, Darienne has shared a wonderful handout with normal reactions to loss. You can also find similar types of websites online that give that type of information. People also write blogs, tell their stories about their own grief. And if you can find a blog that was written by someone who's experienced a similar loss, sometimes it's like reading an autobiography, or it's like, wow, that's so different. I find it fascinating that other people's experiences are so different from mine. Podcasts are also a great thing. If you've never listened to one, they're pretty cool, because if you're saying, I don't have the concentration to read a website, you don't have to read a podcast. You just plug it in and listen. You can listen to 30 seconds. You can listen to the whole thing. You can start it and stop it, and nobody's going to pass judgment for how you engage with the podcast. They're wonderful resources. So I think at this point, what we want to do is see if there are any questions or comments, and I'm going to take a minute to look in the chat box to see what popped up in there while we were talking.
There were a lot of really great responses about people doing certain rituals, eating, around creating quilts. But one thing I want to go back to, because I just saw it zoom past, and I just wanted to say, I saw that someone lost their bird today of 29 years. And I mean, talk about disenfranchised loss. There's not going to be a lot of people who sort of feel that with you. But 29 years you were together. My goodness, I'm so sorry for your loss.
We'll keep you in our thoughts. And actually, it's interesting because we were talking about online gatherings. The Rainbow Bridge is a wonderful concept. It's a concept that someone developed about what happens to our pets when they pass. But the Rainbow Bridge also has a candle lighting ritual that they do at the same time on the same day every week. And so if anyone in the group is mourning the loss of a pet and you want to be with other people who share that grief, Google the Rainbow Bridge candle lighting ceremony. I think it used to be Monday nights, but don't quote me on that. But if it's helpful for you to know that you're focusing on your loss at the same time as people all over the planet, that's a wonderful ritual. And there are some other wonderful examples of ways that people have established continuing bonds or rituals. Cemetery visits are so important to a lot of people, and it's kind of fascinating. I'm a trustee at Albany Rural Cemetery. I'm on the board, and one of the things that we're thinking about right now is how we can create different spaces at the cemetery for people who don't want a traditional burial. So we know that sometimes there isn't a grave site or a headstone to go to, and we're trying to think about meaningful ways to let the cemetery be a place that others can go. So if you have thoughts or ideas about that for me, I would love to hear them, because I will take them and share them, and we'll try to do something about it. Somebody mentioned clothing from a friend, and that's a beautiful example of what's called a linking object. And linking objects are wonderful things. They're material, physical possessions that have significance or meaning that connect us to someone else. And a lot of times people will say it's a piece of jewelry, it's clothing, it might be a photograph. I mean, it can be absolutely anything. And I think those can really be used to help develop rituals. So they're powerful connections. Oh, this is wonderful. Someone says her brothers and she texts each other when they're cooking from her dad's recipes. Food is such a powerful connector, and Reimagine Life is a program that was started a couple years ago by an organization in San Francisco, and they had a wonderful presentation by a chef that was about how food can be used to cope with loss. And it was all about recipes and sharing meals and sharing stories about food. So I think that's another thing, that even if you can't physically be in the same space, you can do things with food virtually. And so many people have told me amazing stories about how families are doing that in so many different places at the same time. Somebody's talking about a memorial wall for pets, but it also has, oh, somebody's planning a memorial wall. Well, good, best wishes with making that a reality. It sounds like it will be a wonderful resource for you. Somebody's put a web link for gratefulness.org, light a candle. I assume that's maybe a candle lighting ritual that you have some control over. I'll have to check that out myself because I'm not familiar with it. So Andrea, thank you so much for teaching me about a new resource. I really appreciate that. I'm just really.
And Darienne, there is one question that I just saw asking any suggestions for elderly folks grieving that do not have computers or Zoom abilities. It is a challenge to find counseling for people.
Well, my cat has come to help answer this question. And she will tell you that right now the community hospice is doing actually all of our visits virtually. We don't have any in-person visits. So our services are free, and they, and my cat's gonna walk right over. And I currently am doing some counseling with people just over the phone for folks who it's just too difficult to use. This is optimal so we can see each other, but if it's too difficult, I do some phone counseling. So hospicegriefservices.org is our website. And can we have more of the death cafes at ARC? Oh, sorry. So what I'll do is I'll put that website and also our contact number in the chat, if that will work okay.
Yeah, and I think also some senior centers are starting to have in-person activities again. I think they are also some of the, I know there's a senior citizens organization in Schenectady that does phone support as well. And they have, for example, a caregiver support group that is phone but not Zoom, so that people who have less technical prowess can still participate. They can call in as opposed to needing to be on a computer. So I think those are things to check out as well. There is so much in the chat box, and this is where I guess, Felicia, I will rely on you if there's a question to bring it to our attention like you just did, because I'm literally just scrolling through the wonderful comments in the chat box about what people do. So here's a ritual with family. Sisters and I use things that belong to our mother. Let my new daughter-in-law wear a special ring for her wedding. So having someone's presence through those linking objects can be really, really powerful. That's a beautiful example of having her there. And the same person said, gave her father's cufflinks to her son for his wedding, so that a part of them was physically there. That's beautiful. There's an art installation in Washington, D.C. with white flags representing the people in our country who've died from COVID. All right. So having those kind of physical community displays that acknowledge the collective loss from this terrible illness, that's very powerful. And I'm so sorry for your loss, because it seems like Kim's husband also passed away from COVID. So I'm so sorry to hear that you were personally affected by that. Trying to scroll down. Boy, there's 16 new messages.
I know, y'all are very fast typers.
Well, this is wonderful. And I love that you're able to participate this way. I just wish I were faster with it. Some people are describing physical spaces in their house, altars, rituals every Sunday, cook and wear your aunt's favorite food and eat with her. What a wonderful way to keep her present in your life. Pictures are powerful. People are describing where they have photographs, pictures of a husband on the kitchen counter with the salt light right next to the picture, and salt lights are therapeutic and healing. So that's great. And just talking to pictures is a wonderful way, the old-fashioned way to stay connected. Let's see.
So
Using
Carla and Darienne, I don't know how many people actually know about death cafes. Is that something you could explain a little bit more?
Sure. And did they say, are there going to be more death cafes at Albany Rural Cemetery? Is that what ARC?
Oh, that's ARC.
That's Albany Rural Cemetery. All right. So for those of you that don't know what a death cafe is, a death cafe is an activity, I guess that's the best way to describe it, a gathering that was created by a gentleman in England years ago. I think they just had their 10th anniversary of the first death cafe within the last couple of weeks. But a death cafe is an opportunity for people to get together and talk about death. It is not a support group. That's really important. So the goal of getting together is not to support each other through loss. It's to just have kind of open and free ranging conversation about anything and everything related to death. And I have co-hosted some death cafes, one of which was at Albany Rural Cemetery. And yes, we will probably host some more out there. They're not only held at cemeteries, we've held them at the Albany Public Library, at the Bethlehem Public Library, the Delmar Reformed Church, the Guilderland Public Library. The last one that was held a couple weekends ago was at Vale Cemetery in the Caretaker's Cottage. I know they're doing them on Zoom now because a lot of people aren't comfortable coming face to face. So I think there's a couple scheduled for October. And if you're interested in learning when and where these are happening, if you go to Facebook and type in Death Cafe Albany, the Facebook page will pop up. If you're having trouble finding that, you can email me at CSOFKA. I'll put my email address in the chat box. So if you need to send me an email asking about the address for death cafes, I can gladly connect you up. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I announce the death cafes on my Twitter feed. So I'm going to type I think it's at Carla Sofka. I don't use Twitter a whole lot, but you can find me on Twitter too. So those are ways. Yeah, and in East Greenbush, they've had some at the library there. There is a death cafe website that publicizes all the death cafes. So if you go to, I think it's www.deathcafe.com, they list all the death cafes around the world because they're now being held everywhere. I attended a death cafe in Hong Kong. So yeah, it's an absolutely fascinating opportunity to have a chance to talk about things that typically aren't socially acceptable. Well, and I'll have to tell the folks at Vale that there was somebody who wished they could have gone, and maybe they will host another one. So oftentimes people are very happy to host them because it's an unusual thing. In the olden days before COVID, one of my colleagues would bake goodies and we'd make tea, because technically you're supposed to have tea and sweets at death cafes as well. So it's a social activity to talk about death with food. So there you go. So thanks for the opportunity to educate people about death cafes, because they are an interesting experience.
They really are. And if there isn't one in your area, you can start one.
Or just,
so if you live, or just go.
Send an email and let us know if you know of a place where one could be hosted. We can try and
oh, you'll travel, Carla? You're so generous.
Well,
so generous.
We had one at a in Altamont, out at a barn in Altamont, there was one. So before COVID, we were really going to interesting places. Like there were a couple at Albany Rural, which is a great place to go because not only do you get the Death Cafe, but you get to hang out in the cemetery when it's done. So it's a wonderfully historic, beautiful place. All right. So I'm not even sure what time it is. I've totally lost track of time. We still have.
Okay. I was actually just going to say, I know we're kind of coming towards the end of our time. I did see, I think Katie had just made one last comment in the chat about the Alzheimer's Association also has some great resources for current caregivers who are dealing with the loss of a person who is still alive.
Awesome.
The loss of who that person was and the change in their relationship. But I didn't know if you had, go ahead.
That's a great example of a non-death loss that is incredibly challenging, because I've heard so many people just say it's like watching someone disappear before your eyes, and there's a concept called anticipatory grief that I'm not sure we mentioned before, because you can actually have significant grief before a loss even happens. And I think dementia related experiences and Alzheimer's are sad, but very appropriate examples of anticipatory grief.
Great. I think the last thing I was just going to say, if there was any final comments or any final questions, but so I will open that up, Darienne, to you and Carla. And then I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and to thank both you, Carla and Darienne, for your time and for this great presentation and having us being able to converse with you for this past almost hour and a half.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Donna. That's very nice of you.
I just want to thank everybody for the wonderful conversation that got started in the chat box, and that, that's one of the silver linings of Zoom. is you have an opportunity for so many people to be able to share what they're thinking.
And for any of you who are in the crucible of loss, any of you who are newly in loss, or those of you who are far away from a loss but really feeling it, we send you our absolute best wishes for your wellness, and good luck. Good luck.
Yeah, be kind to yourself.
Very, very kind to yourself. Take good care.
Oh, I see lots of thank yous. So I'm glad that everyone else seems to have agreed with what a great conversation we were all able to have today.
Well, it's just a privilege to spend time with people who can benefit from what I've learned over time from all of my best teachers, who are the people who are grieving.
Thank you, Kristen. So for just a quick reminder too, for any of those who are still on, we do have our second session of this 5-part series that'll take place on Tuesday, October 12th from 3 to 4:30. The topic of that is cultural, spiritual, and trauma awareness.
Awesome.
How different faiths and cultures approach grief. So hopefully we will look forward to seeing everybody at that as well. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day and week.